Initially developed to provide an export alternative to the P-40 for France and the UK, North America's P-51 would prove to be a superb fighter that would rank among the most decisive weapons of the Second World War. With its streamlined airframe and highly efficient cooling system, the aircraft would reach new heights when equipped with a far more advanced Packard Merlin engine. Though its early years would prove troublesome, it would solve long-standing issues regarding the lack of long-range bomber escorts and achieve a level of performance beyond its Axis contemporaries. Welcome to another Plain Encyclopedia voiced article. I'm your host, Tony, and today, I'll be covering the North American P-51B series. If you like what we do, remember to subscribe so you don't miss a single video. The P-51's development is rather unique for an American fighter, as it was originally an export aircraft for France and Britain in 1940. While the Allies possessed examples of modern fighter aircraft such as the Dewoitin D-520 and Supermarine Spitfire Mark Is, they also employed a large number of outdated aircraft in comparison to the better-equipped German Luftwaffe. The Allies saw the P-40 as the ideal solution, however. It was unavailable for export at the time. In January of 1940, Oliver Eccles, in charge of Air Corps procurement, would suggest to the Allied Purchasing Commission to approach a manufacturer that lacked any major contracts involved with U.S. rearmament. This suggestion would see the British Purchasing Commission returning to older offers from firms they had turned down, in particular North American Aviation. This time, however, North American was given the option to either produce license-built P-40s or instead to design a new aircraft with the aid of research data acquired from Curtiss-Wright on the XP-46 fighter prototype. North American Aviation's small but enthusiastic team would choose the latter and prepared to design a new fighter built around the Allison V-1710 engine. The first step in developing the new fighter was purchasing the most recent data on fighter design from Curtiss-Wright's XP-40 and XP-46 prototypes, and acquiring the new breakthrough laminar flow airfoil designs recently developed by the NACA. This information was made available to the design team headed by Edgar Schmidt, a German-born aeronautical engineer who had previously worked for Fokker and General Motors. The work soon began on a new fighter under the designation NA-50B, later changed to NA-73 under a common and straightforward design strategy. Schmidt would work to build a plane that would excel by incorporating all of the most recent developments in fighter design to produce an aircraft that was both cutting-edge yet conventional. The Curtiss-Wright prototypes were a starting point that was quickly surpassed, with engineer and aerodynamicist Ed Horkey considering the prototypes too dated for use on the new project, and the data was discarded. The same cannot be said for the NACA data on low-drag laminar wing design which they received. Great care was taken to build the prototype in good time. The prototype, the NA-73X, would make use of a number of components from North American's AT-6 trainer, including its landing gear, hydraulics, and electrical systems. Remarkably, the construction of the prototype was completed on the 102nd day of the project, but would have to wait another 20 days for its Allison engine. With the program approaching testing, the British were awaiting the results and readying their own test pilots to become acquainted with the new plane. The prototype was first flown by American test pilot Vance Breese on the 20th of October 1940. It would go on to make several more test flights before having to be repaired after an accident with test pilot Paul Balfour. The accident was a result of pilot error, who failed to switch over from an empty fuel tank, and as such the incident did not reflect poorly on the design itself. As a sleek new fighter was taking shape, the British Purchasing Commission would notify NAA that the aircraft's RAF designation was to be the Mustang in a communique sent in December 1940. In British service, the Mustang would take a different developmental path than what was proceeding in the United States. While the British were receiving their Mustang fighter aircraft, the US had been forced to develop the aircraft into a dive bomber, the A-36, as funds for fighter development had been expended for 1942. In the case of the RAF, the Mustang Mark I went into service as soon as was practicable and saw their first squadrons, number 161 and 613, receive supplies of the new aircraft in April of 1942. Its long-range, high-speed, and effective armament were used to great effect over the Low Countries, as they harassed rail and road communications, while also remaining quite capable against enemy fighters wherever they were encountered. Even by this early mark, the once uncertain contract they signed with North American had already paid off. While the aircraft did earn good marks with its pilots, there was one area they felt the aircraft particularly lacking. The Allison engines that the early Mustangs were equipped with were rather disappointing when it came to high-altitude performance due to their single-stage single-speed superchargers. Though this was by no means surprising, it represented an area where performance could be significantly improved. It wasn't long until the idea arose to fit the Mustang with an engine possessing better high-altitude performance, a combination that might well produce an exceptional fighter that was as capable at high altitude as it was down low. The first major step towards this came on 29th of April 1942, when Wing Commander Ian Campbell Orde invited one of the Rolls-Royce's test pilots, Ronald W. Harker, to test the new aircraft. Harker was impressed by its performance, and he believed that if the aircraft was fitted with the new Merlin 61, it would be able to outpace a similarly equipped Spitfire by a considerable margin. The Merlin 61 was the obvious choice for many reasons, chief of which was its two-stage two-speed supercharger, which stood to offer the plane exceptional high-altitude performance. To this end, a Mustang Mark I was provided to Rolls-Royce at Hucknall to undergo the necessary modifications. By the beginning of June 1942, the British had correctly projected that the Mustang's top speed would be increased to 430 miles per hour at an altitude of 25,000 feet, which was roughly twice as fast as the Allison-powered Mustang at that altitude. When the test aircraft was complete, the result was quite impressive, as during a fly-off between a Spitfire Mark IX and a Mustang, both fitted with the Merlin 61s, the Mustang quickly outpaced the Spitfire. Across the Atlantic, a parallel development began underway after a study of the Mustang's combat debut with the RAF. The new United States Army Air Force, no longer constrained by funding, rushed to acquire supplies of the Mustang and sought to re-engine the fighter to improve its high-altitude performance. By the early half of the summer of 1942, both British and American Mustang experiments were underway. While the Mustang was previously seen as a side project which was never a wholly American or British effort, it was by then extremely clear that the design had tremendous potential, and the development of which was of immense importance to the Allies. Re-engineering the Mustang was by no means an easy task, as the Merlin was considerably heavier than the Allison and it required a larger cooling system. To achieve this, the radiator was reworked, with the oil cooler moved apart from the radiator matrix to a forward position, and the ducting of the entire scoop assembly being redesigned. Earlier aerodynamic and buffeting issues caused by the radiator intake were also resolved by moving the scoop out of the boundary layer under the fuselage. The resulting setup would also achieve the Narrated effect, which produced thrust that offset the drag caused by the scoop. Additionally, the carburetor's intake duct was moved beneath the nose, which also necessitated lowering the wing to accommodate the lower cowl. In addition to higher cooling requirements, the new Merlin engine weighed 350 pounds more than the Allison and would mount a larger, heavier propeller, which would represent a significant shift in weight. To compensate, 61 pounds of ballast was added, the primary fuselage longerons were strengthened, and the wings were strengthened and moved lower and forward. These changes would also help to compensate for the stronger vortex generated by the propeller and the greater forces generated by the improved ailerons. The new engine and the subsequent operations would also result in some yaw instability. Adding a fin ahead of the horizontal stabilizer seemed an adequate solution, but it would not be undertaken until far later. While the testing for most of these modifications was done through a variety of converted airframes, the prototype that brought them all together was the P-51B, which first flew on 1st of October 1942. The importance placed on this aircraft was considerable, as several months prior, a large order for 1,200 P-51As was placed by the US government on the provision that their production could be switched for P-51Bs given advance notice. The P-51B would prove promising, but it was troubled by radiator issues which would remain with the aircraft through January of 1943. These were tracked down to a chemical reaction which was found to be degrading the coolant tubes and was resolved by a lacquer liner. There were also airflow issues within the radiator, which were solved through moving its aftercooler core to improve airflow through the scoop. The prototype's last major issue was the tendency for its air scoop to produce loud and worrying vibrations at high speed. Resolving the problem once again required them to change the geometry of the scoop. This was solved by the aforementioned modification that moved it out of the boundary layer below the wing, and further improved as the depth of the gutter was increased and the inlet size was reduced. While development on the Merlin-powered P-51s proceeded, the USAAF had formulated and launched a strategic bombing campaign dedicated to destroying industries vital to the German war effort. Many early interwar theorists, such as Major Harold George, would describe a vague economic web that could be destroyed and force an industrial and morale collapse. But in 1943, these theories were put to the test. The practical details of the campaign were laid out at the Allied Conference at Casablanca. There, a series of targets was decided upon, but later altered to a plan that favored targeting aircraft and submarine production, in addition to ball-bearing plans. However, the main concern for USAAF bombing operation was that thus far all daylight strategic bombing campaigns had ended in failure after formations of unescorted bombers were shredded by fighters. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1943, the USAAF would launch numerous raids against targets in western Germany, though the bombers could only be escorted over the Low Countries by P-47s and P-38s. It wasn't long until these range limitations were understood and soon after exploited by the Luftwaffe. Wherever Luftwaffe aircraft were untroubled by Allied fighters, they were free to make use of their most effective anti-bomber tactics. Losses among bombers were extremely high as the lack of long-range fuel tanks for the P-47 meant it couldn't escort the bombers over the most treacherous areas, and the P-38 experienced a variety of harsh mechanical issues in the extremely cold weather experienced at high altitudes. Losses among the bomber forces were heavy, and they were largely prevented from carrying out raids deep within Germany until a suitable escort emerged. As a result of the pressure to produce new long-range fighters for the escalating campaign in Europe, the first P-51Bs were produced before the prototype had gone through its testing and modification cycles. The first plane, a P-51B-1, was completed 31st of March 1943 and would include several features that would later be found unsound on prototype. As a result, these initial planes would have to be altered accordingly and would have many parts that were non-interchangeable with later models. In addition to reworking the air scoop and radiator, they would also have their ailerons modified, both to improve their effectiveness and to remove a steel diaphragm, which would interfere with the plane's magnetic compass. Most importantly, the decision was made that the aircraft would incorporate an additional 85-gallon fuselage fuel tank, which would provide the aircraft with phenomenal range. With this new aircraft, the USAAF would finally possess what they had been searching for. With the addition of the new internal fuel tank, the aircraft would be capable of deep incursions into German airspace and would deliver on what was promised back in the spring of 1942. They were excellent fighters, especially at high altitude, a licensed production of the British Merlin 61. This engine would later be replaced with the Packard V1637 in later models of the aircraft, this being a license-built Merlin 63 which was geared for better performance at medium altitude. These engines, combined with a low-drag fuselage and laminar design wings, would provide the aircraft with a superb climb rate, a high top speed at altitude, and exceptional high-speed maneuverability. The new P-51Bs would make their first major debut with the 8th Air Force in early 1944. Though the introduction was not as smooth as had been hoped, squadrons reported a number of issues with the new aircraft, which included high-altitude fuel transfer failures with external tanks, glycol reserve tanks that leaked and froze, radiator corrosion and coolant leaks, radios and spark plugs failing, and excessive oil loss. However, the USAAF hadn't the time to immediately resolve these teething issues, and with these problems passed along to the manufacturer and Air Force maintenance services, the P-51s would soon play a key role in the escalating bomber offensive. In December of 1943, the USAAF established a Joint Strategic Air Command to consolidate their bomber forces over both the European and Mediterranean theaters and drive them towards a unified objective. With General Spaatz in command of all strategic bomber forces and Major General James Doolittle in command of the 8th Air Force in England, the USAAF would now have a clear strategic direction and more aggressive leadership. Doolittle would take a pivotal role in revising the existing strategy into one which proved instrumental in undermining and dismantling the Luftwaffe in the coming weeks. Crucially, he recognized the inadequacy in trying to undermine the Luftwaffe's fighter strength solely through targeting the production of the new aircraft. To hold to this existing, overly conservative strategy was hopeless, and the invasion of France was scheduled for 5 months after he took office. Targeting the factories alone wasn't enough, and thus Doolittle would give the order for returning escort fighters to perform fighter sweeps and seek out enemy planes in the air and on the ground. Among the first and most important moves was to create a more effective relay systems for the fighters, further increasing the time they could spend over enemy territory. This change in tactics would have immediate and profound impacts as they began to be widely implemented in February and March of 1944. The first major achievement of the new strategy were the widespread losses inflicted on the twin-engine fighter forces, which had earlier proven themselves as potent anti-bomber weapons. Against the new long-range fighters, they were almost defenseless and were withdrawn in March. Similar effects were felt throughout the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, which thanks to the new P-51s were left without any safe haven. Whenever the bombers were over Germany, their escort fighters could make their appearance. Luftwaffe attrition escalated as airfields that were once ignored were now periodically harassed by fighters that attacked transiting and grounded aircraft. Doolittle did all he could to promote these attacks and would allow for the destruction of aircraft on the ground to count towards a pilot ace status. These attacks would prove costly to the USAAF, but well worth it as Luftwaffe operational losses for all aircraft increased sharply and it robbed them of the ability to train new pilots in secure airspace. This shift in strategy and subsequent success would prove instrumental to the USAAF in the following months, as their responsibilities were soon to broaden when the Allies landed in France. With these new policies in place, the Luftwaffe would be thoroughly disrupted as a result of Spaat's strategy and Doolittle and Kepner's tactics. The USAAF would end up inflicting punishing losses on the Luftwaffe in the air, disrupting the manufacturing of new aircraft, and eventually causing chronic fuel shortages that severely limited their ability to conduct large-scale operations of any kind. In this, the P-51 would prove essential with its exceptional high-altitude performance and its endurance that could take it anywhere over Germany. It would take considerable effort to develop the P-51B, and even greater hurdles would have to be overcome to produce them in the quantities needed. In the end, both were achieved, and the P-51B would enter large-scale operation in the spring of 1944. In spite of its harsh teething issues, it would become among the most decisive weapons of the Second World War. With its incredible range and medium and high-altitude performance, the aircraft would prove instrumental in establishing air superiority over Western Europe prior to Operation Overlord and contesting the skies over Germany itself. Its design, while not revolutionary, was thoroughly advanced and represented a considerable leap in aerodynamics and airframe design. The P-51B would, however, be only a starting point for the Packard Mustangs, as further refinement would result in the iconic and much more widely produced P-51D. This concludes our look at the North American P-51B. If you like what we do and want to see more, remember to subscribe so you don't miss a single video. Also, don't forget to take a look at our extensive collection of articles on our website, plain-encyclopedia.com. Thank you.